Stephen, did you and Joanna want to present the main parts of the book and then we open a conversation? Um, I know there's been some discussion of it before, but is that how you wanted to organize this?
Oh, well, the plan was to have relatively little presentation and more just a conversation with Maitrayee. It was sort of a reverse
Perfect.
of the thing we did with her book. Was it last year or was it 2 years ago?
Yeah, last year.
Okay. Excellent, excellent. I would say I'm sorry for being sort of disorganized because I'm so busy, which is semi-true, but it's also like I'm on research leave and I'm still really incompetent at things. So it's kind of like when you quit drinking and you think all your problems are that you drink too much, and then you realize you're just a horrible person. That's what this research leave has also been like. But no, that's also very exciting because Maitrie's amazing. Okay, well then I think I don't know. Well, I don't know, Jen, if you've had a chance to read the book. If not, I know
No,
maybe you'll have.
unfortunately, sorry.
Um, I just wanted to say, and I will try not to be too expressive because I know Stephen really doesn't like it, and given that he's sick, I don't want to embarrass him anymore. But I would say that, this book has, when he gave it to me, I immediately thought it has the best opening line I've ever read, um, which is to the tune of the war song War, or not to Edward Starr's song War. Instead of war, what is it good for? Work, what is it good for? But I thought what was really important is that this book for me answered or brought up some really key questions about how we think about value, but also how people contend with different value and values. And what that means to be not just having something like creativity and art be commodified, but to be a creative commodified subject. And in this sense, I thought it worked on a number of different levels. And as I was reading it, I personally, and I'm happy to discuss, but like I personally felt that it really touched on the ways in which, even in our commodification, and even within the difficulties and challenges of paying rent, so to speak, right? We still have this kind of unextinguishable part of ourselves that understands there's something more. But also the ways in which, I think this is really critical, like even our dreams are commodified creatively. And so when I was reading this, I found it both, and maybe this is the best way to, maybe this is what all the great pieces of things I've read does. I found it both like extremely challenging and not giving easy answers, but also incredibly inspiring. And I think more than just, and I'm sure Mithra, you have much more in-depth things to discuss, but I thought much more than just creative workers. I think it's a really almost increasingly universalizing aspect in terms of one, how creativity has been integrated and co-opted within so many professions, including our own. I mean, now all of us are expected to be creative and to be things, and I thought it really spoke to that. But also, I think the dreams that you speak about, right, and the difficult balance and tension that you speak about in the book, are ones that are increasingly universal and are ones that, while you were obviously speaking about a very particular type of worker and sector, are things that can actually, I think, really speak to a common solidarity across different classes, across different sectors, and is a progressively common experience of how we balance this tension between alienation and non-alienation that I think all of us feel. Um, so thank you for the amazing first line, but thank you for what I think is just a really wonderful, provocative, and challenging book.
Thanks, Peter.
Okay. So I guess I will start. So thank you very much, Stephen, Joanna, Peter, and Genevieve for joining us today. And we'll be discussing, as Peter said, this great book, The Wages of Dreamwork. And it's such a timely book also because it kind of summarizes something that we have been probably in our scholarship and critical thinking have been looking at it quite intensely in the last 20 years or so. Um, but I guess it still continues to be a conundrum how to have a more emancipatory relationship to work, but also how to have that in terms of also building collective allegiances and not feel alienated in our own fulfilling sense of work. I thought, like, just to start off, because it would be interesting to see, since the book is really well written and comes really well, all the ideas and also the empirical material, and it's a collaboration between two scholars. So, if you could start by saying how this did this project come about, how did you start writing, and then set off more.
Do
Um,
you want like a cool theoretical reason, or do you want like the boring actual reasons?
Both.
I mean, because like the boring actual reasons, where that Joanna was doing a PhD in Essex but had a very poor funding. So I was trying to find ways to get funding to sort of basically have her not starving. Um, so that's the actual reason, right? Um, and I think most projects to begin with, I would like my friends not to starve, are pretty good projects. Um, a slightly more elaborate theory reason would be, I think that both of us have lots of friends who work in various creative fields as artists, as designers, as musicians, and we see them struggle through wanting to develop their practice, what they're doing, but also they're working crappy jobs, they're working long hours. And so it was more trying to think, I guess, with our friends and the conditions that they're in. Um, and to start from that. Do you want to add anything to that, Joanna?
Yes, actually, it's been so long. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, because I had to swap my headphones because the other ones weren't connecting for some reason. I think we have actually met at one of the Precarious Workers Brigade events. I mean, it's been so long ago, I can't quite remember, but I think it's somehow linked, perhaps. And Precarious Workers Brigade was this sort of collective in London of workers in creative and cultural sort of industries, some academic lectures as well, like trying to think through um, their work situations. And like like Stephen said, sorry, it often meant that people had to work multiple jobs. They had to do other unrelated jobs to sort of continue their creative practice and so on. So I think we might have actually met at one of those events, but I can't remember. The group is not non-existent anymore, but a lot of our writing and sort of resources are still up online from that period. So I guess that was kind of the start, and I think I was at the end of my master's thinking about my PhD, which in the end ended up sort of touching on the subject as well. And at that point, me and Stephen met.
No, I mean, that's really, really nice to see. Also, very, as you say, very quotidian reasons. But I guess you also touched upon that there were actually issues that you both felt connected to because of your proximity to the creative sector. And this is, I mean, to come to my next kind of question is about the theoretical inspiration, because I feel like, even the trajectory that you take on the book, and I like that you don't have a singular idea that you are tied to, because I think we have seen a kind of shift from uh, looking at modern work sphere as alienating, but even within the Marxist framework, like as you mentioned, the autonomist tradition then kind of broadens it up to talk about the everydayness of that, not necessarily everything being alienating. So, I mean, was it a challenge to kind of bring all these different ideas together? Or, I mean, how did you choose to have a particular kind of thought process when you were like sorting out your empirical material?
I suppose the biggest theoretical influence is probably from autonomous Marxism, but there's also a fair degree of discontent with certain strains of post-autonomia, particularly around the immaterial labor debates.
Mm.
Um, so it's almost like, yeah, I suppose the, the two figures who probably get cited most are probably Negri and Silvia Federici. Um, so I guess that would be our like theory family. Um, But then, yeah, but then drawing from sort of a broader array of sources. Geez, I can't even remember how many. Do you remember, Joanna?
Well, and the whole Wages for Housework project, I guess, as well, was a big part of theoretical inspiration for us, I guess.
No, it's like I think like I really kind of found it as you mentioned, like even something like so well established like the immaterial labor tradition also, but it's like I found both of you being very present in the debates and kind of able to really finely analyze even something which has been accepted as a single strand or somewhat of a dominant strand in understanding work. Um, the other thing that was like quite fascinating to see was the emergence of the city. And I think when you say Hart and Negri, like the multitude and the city, and how that kind of is the backdrop in a lot of your work. Um, so I guess like in some ways, do you feel that in order to have this kind of new imaginations with work and community building, do city and being in a kind of place of possibilities, is it important to what uh, you gathered from your also working with creative and artisan sector?
Well, I suppose a lot of the book comes out of honestly kinds of moments of frustration where the kind of theory tools we were using were telling us like, okay, the new metropolis is going to produce these conditions for the emergent sort of multitude class, which is going to have all these great, inherent communist features and is going to do all these cool things. And then you go to London, that's obviously not happening, right? And so a big part of the book is trying to figure out like, oh, okay, well, if that's not happening, what is happening? Um, and a lot of what we talk about is sort of like the dynamic of people becoming very invested in their practice as an individualizing idea rather than collective conditions. Um, in some ways, despite coming out this year or last year, it's a book which kind of is about 10 years old, and I think we did the majority of the actually the theory development like 10 years ago. Um, and so it feels slightly embarrassing that we don't sort of engage more with questions around like AI infrastructure, digital networks, and sort of much larger scale things which are affecting creative labor much more directly now. But it just felt like having sort of like slacked off actually finishing it for years, it just seemed like it was like, no, just gonna finish it and get it out.
I guess in terms of the city, I mean, at that point in time, we were looking at Brick Lane Market. So we've got all these also debates about gentrification, about how sort of artists are being people who sort of push certain areas and then become displaced from them, which even further sort of limits the, if we assume that there are possibilities for them to come together, it further pushes them sort of away and alienates them sort of uh, from outside, right? So that was part of it as well. But yeah, it's been a while ago that we made all these theoretical choices. So it's kind of, I feel like I'm failing an exam now, trying to remember what was the actual reasoning behind some of these things. But I guess Stephen is quite eclectic in his academic work. I guess I am too. So to answer your previous question, no, it wasn't an issue to combine all these different sort of theoretical strands. I guess it sort of made sense at the time, and now on rereading it, I think it still does and makes it kind of accessible. I guess we're both also um, big fans of accessible academic writing, or if you can call it that. So hopefully that comes through in the writing and the sort of reasoning.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think I didn't feel it dated at all. Like, I think that's also why it is so potent. Like, yes, the AI probably there will be nuances to the work, but I still, when I go to Brick Lane, feel like I've seen those people that you're talking about and continue. Maybe the shops have shrunk or some of the shifts have happened. But the question of the city, because I think that runs through the book in many ways, like, also the understanding the situation is perspective or psychogeography, that actually I didn't know about much. Like in some ways that walking the city or feeling, having a feel for it, and how different groups kind of appropriates it also kind of changes the geography of it. And as you mentioned, Joanna, that this has been more a case of gentrification. Um, but in some ways, do you still, like, if we look at, I guess this is a bit more speculative, but do you still feel like in the future something like a city would be the center of some of this politics, or we kind of feel like no, cities, modern cities today actually do not have the potential of uh, being, inducive to diversity, and theoretically a lot of these writers have written about for so many years.
Mm.
I could certainly see how, if maybe not cities or at least sort of municipal areas could be functioning in ways which would be conducive of commons initiatives in ways which I think we would see quite desirable. Um, it's not something we specifically explore here because I mean, like the stuff about, for instance, about psychogeography and understanding the city and how value functions. It ends up being quite speculative in the version here. But if you look at ways it's done much more practically, you look at the work of someone like Callum Kent, looking at sort of the organizing of Deliveroo workers and having to understand how people aggregate in different parts of the city and how you sort of labor organize by understanding those patterns of city life. So I think there are ways to take those ideas and make them, sometimes they're a bit poetic here, and because I like dabbling in a bit of poetic writing in theory. Um, but you can actually make them much more operationalized as well.
Yeah, I mean, there is a kind of running theme of actually, and being a sociologist, I might be actually, kind of projecting it, but I felt like in some ways both of you are trying to say that an ethnographic lens is what is important. Am I right in thinking, like, actually to able to keep records of the small tweakments or how essentially labor conditions, in its very minute details, captures also somehow a resistance to what is expected or has been kind of just presumed?
Well, one of the core problems we had in how to approach in the initial project was we were trying to think through when people are in self-organized spaces of work, like you have an arts, like a market where you have self-organized producers. It should now, if you go through Brick Lane, there's a lot less actual creative projects in the market than there were 10 years ago. It's almost all exclusively food and actually very little creative production. But anyways, so if you have these spaces where people are engaged in self-organized, self-managed work, we wanted to think about like how that shifts your relationship to work. But the problem is how you ask someone that in a way that doesn't just automatically impose a category on how they're thinking about it. And so trying to get that sense of the changing relationship, yeah, can be partly ethnographic, can be media accounts, can be trying to sort of just almost drift in the space and work through different forms of data. Because if you just ask someone like, how do you think about work? You're almost like over determining the answer by asking the question a certain way. So there's an interesting, almost like I guess, sort of methodological problem of how to not let one's concepts over determine the situation.
Yeah. No, I see that. I mean, because I think the sector that you're looking at, and that's also ties to what Peter was discussing, just at the onset, about how in many ways, I think since, like, at least from what I know of, like early 20th century, art emerges as this kind of escape or the critical area where, fulfillment or everything else can be. And sometimes I think it's over inscribed in some ways. Like, personally, I feel like somehow everyone kind of sees art as the way out for all our politics and everything. Marcuse and Roncière and so many others have spoken about that. But in the book itself, like, when you are looking at it through this sector, somehow it's also a bigger question, right? Like, how does one have a relationship with work which is not just about one's own fulfillment? I think, like, the wages of dream work is death of the social, which is a very powerful kind of allegory to think about this, because in some ways, being in a creative sector, you always think about fulfillment, but in a very neoliberal way still, like in the art world. It's all about validating the artist, and no matter how much we are thinking about this sector as antithesis to this individualizing rhetoric. But what I would like to probably also from your empirical material, was there any point in which you thought that actually this sector kind of is self-critical of itself, or it's just that they are just representing this larger strand of work today being more or less a self-interest or self-aggrandizing mechanism? I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but in some ways, just to simplify, art and creative work as seen as the sector which is resisting this larger complicated and inequalities, but on the other hand, the people who are part of it are themselves seen as somehow propagating this individualizing narrative.
I'm sure there are probably instances in which people are, if anything, fully self-aware of the many contradictory positions they're in. But the problem is that you would find it mainly in how people would joke about it, or they would be snarky online, or it was very easy to fall back into a sort of kind of a very individualizing frame, because, like, when people would have problems, they would just no longer have a stall at the market. So the way you deal with it was by exit. Um, there didn't seem to be a sort of an idea of like, oh, could we collectively organize and make demands upon the owners of the space? Um, if sort of arts and cultural work is important to London as a metropolis, could there be a forum in which that would be put forward as a sort of claim? Yeah. I don't think we saw a lot of that. But also part of the thing is, yeah. Um, did, did you, what do you think, Joanna?
I don't know. I'm kind of thinking that maybe it's not so useful to speak now about those people at that market. I mean, I'm so far removed from it now. It's hard to tell, like, I mean, it's hard to relate your question to those interviews that we've conducted by then. I feel like I think the answer is both, that like some people would be aware, some people would not be aware at all of these problems or issues. And I think today it's still true that it's both. And also it depends sort of on who you're talking to, I guess. I mean, it's a whole other sort of discussion about like who gets to be a creative and cultural worker, right? I mean, we've got class issues, we've got gender, we've got race. I mean, the whole sort of pool is limited. And I find in conversations with people, like often these sort of circumstances will then sort of define the level maybe of awareness or sort of self-critique in a sense. And also speaking back to your previous question about how this sort of how do we see the city like today in this sense. I mean, I can't speak about London, but in Poland, I can see since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, I can see that there are spaces popping up that have not been there for the past 10 years. I mean, we've had the pandemic in between that has pretty much killed off a lot of sort of small initiatives and sort of artist associations and things like that. But since the influx of sort of migrants from Ukraine, there are now spaces popping up that are specifically including artists from the East and sort of restarting the same discussions again, right? So about spaces, about access to spaces, about who funds the spaces, about self-organization, about who can sort of participate in the sort of collective endeavors. So yes, I guess they can, but like Stephen said, it's all very local now and very specific, rather than on a larger scale, I'd say.
Before Peter comes in, I would say that, okay, part of why I was unable to sort of actually just go and sort of plow through and just finish off the book, which we probably should have done like 10 years earlier. There's both very practical, boring reasons and theoretical reasons. The very practical reason is I had a very messy divorce, and that made me sort of unable to actually deal with the writing for a few years. But the more theory reason is how a book diagnoses a problem, but doesn't know how to offer any solution. And so what I did is that I wrote two other books trying to find solutions. One about art and strategy, and one about collective practices among artists. So in a way, it should probably be seen with those two other books as trying to find ways to sort of almost diagnose sort of here's what happens when you get too invested in your practice and your labor and in individualizing way, but specifically avoiding saying here's what we do, because I don't think there is a sort of ready-made answer. Peter?
No, sorry to come in. I just wanted to follow up on that question though, because it was something that when I read the book, it also struck me, which is about, I think, this kind of geographical relation between the types of creative individuals or artists that you're speaking to. And I speak to this in terms of like, from a personal experience, the different levels of commodification and therefore different levels of subjectivity by people in different areas. So, for instance, I grew up in Baltimore, which by UK standards is a very large city, but a very small city in the US. And as members of a kind of like, kind of quite left-wing hardcore punk and hip hop scenes, it was very interesting because I don't think anybody in that um, group thought that like this was going to lead to a career or anything. I mean, you did DIY things just because you were sick of the mainstream culture and it was pretty boring before the internet, to be quite honest. And in a sense, there was a way in which, because Baltimore was so isolated from mainstream culture, I mean, all the big bands went to DC. You would know this, Stephen, to Philadelphia or even New York or even Richmond. Nobody came to Baltimore, so we had our own scene, even though we were like only 35 minutes from DC. It was a very different hardcore scene because there wasn't any professional community in that sense, right? And then when I moved to a small mining town in West Virginia, it was even more so, right? And I bring this up because I would say that my initial impression would be, okay, well, in these bigger centers, like when I moved to DC or when I've moved to London, would be much more empowering. But I'm not sure that's entirely true. Because there's also a lot more pressure in these areas to be part of dominant
Yeah.
trends, to be part of commodified things. The fact that you could make a living being an artist which, in West Virginia at the time when I was growing up, just was pretty much unheard of, right? Meant that a lot of these spaces did feel a bit more exclusionary to people who were maybe not into those scenes, but also was a lot more commodifying to people who were. And I'm wondering, like, and I know Stephen, you've also had a kind of diverse experience of living in a lot of different places and have been much more adapted to these. So I was kind of wondering how that played out because it is something I've experienced in my own life in terms of the different levels upon which creativity is commodified and the diverse tensions that this brings up depending about where you are and your relation to a kind of mainstream creative work culture.
My first thought it's not going to be helpful, but I just like it anyways. Is have you seen the Colchester Creative Quarter?
No. I should.
Oh my God,
Did it
it's so
exist when I did my PhD?
it's so embarrassingly bad. Like they were like, we'll build an art museum and then we'll have a cinema and then everyone will come and the rents will go up. And like it's so Colchester because their attempt at gentrification has completely failed. They've had this in there for like 7 years, but they can't get a single restaurant to rent space in the building. And it's the moment where I feel proud to live here, where it's like we failed at gentrification.
Okay, I'm definitely coming then.
It's awesome.
Yeah, I mean this is fascinating too. I guess like what Peter and now Stephen and also Joanna is pointing out, like the city space to actually have that kind of dynamism. A lot of things have to be also non-city like in a way, and I guess like inherently like how the Parisian in the early 20th century or cities when it became like an intellectual kind of very rich intellectual life was also a time where it was more in shifts and transitions. Now like as you mentioned like London, or I mean it is a really capitalistic kind of spaces, I mean, and that is also something you see global cities everywhere. And Colchester also being a city now um, has so many elements which is undefinable and unpresuming. So there is something to talk about that, like what essentially,
Well,
in a way, yeah.
I think it's funny. Okay, there's a really great book by Kirsten Forkett called Artistic Lives. This is what 2012. Do you remember, Joanna?
Mm-hmm.
And she compares the sort of art scenes and conditions of artists working in London and Berlin. And a lot of it comes down to a very simple thing. People could afford to live in Berlin. They couldn't afford to live in London. And the sort of secret to vibrant artistic communities which do cool things is very simple. They're affordable. And that's what actually made the Colchester attempt to be so tragic because they tried to do all that, but then tried to charge even higher rents. And so they missed the whole point about what fosters community is that people go to places where they can actually afford to live and do things in that space. Um, if the entire plan is just to upscale immediately, no one's gonna want to go there. Um, yeah. Um,
Ariana and then Peter.
Yes. Yes. So sorry for coming in late. I had a meeting with a student. Yes. So my question is based on the discussion I've caught and the book which I really love. Yeah. So yeah. So my question is whether you think yeah, I love that framework of starting with from the wages per hour's work and the biblical verse as well, to think about wages of dream work as the death of the social imperversion, as there is some kind of individualistic struggle to pursue the survival of one's practice. So based on that, I was wondering whether you think that this can be extended to remaining within the idea of wages for housework, so the sphere of social reproduction. So do you think that that discourse whereby an individual pursuit of survival let's say, not of artistic practice, let's say survival itself. So I'm talking about struggles of social reproduction, housing, welfare. I was wondering whether you think that your discussion and can be not applied, but used as a starting point for making sense of similar dynamics in the spheres of social reproduction, whereby the pursuit of one's survival in terms of housing, affordability of living conditions, or welfare. Yeah, you think that same dynamics apply? And the second question, and please feel free not to answer it, is whether over the past 10, is whether you think that 10 years ago, the conditions you are mapping in the book, yeah, how much has it changed? Do you think it would have been, do you think that the book would have come to different conclusions if completed, I don't know, 8 years ago, let's say? Thanks.
I think there's a lot of interesting overlaps in conceptual overlaps about thinking about artistic labor and social reproductive labor. And if I've understood any of that, it's because I've listened to our dear and sometimes and now sometimes unfortunately departed friends like Marina Vishmet. Um, the way I think we tend to look at that overlap in this book is more about the idea that sort of certain forms of labor are labors of the self. They're not just a practice you do, it is a direct expression of yourself. Um, and I think that is an interesting way to sort of frame how sometimes, you know, the caring mother or the caring parent does so because it's of their nature. The artist does because it's of their nature. Works that is form of your nature. And that it's funny, when I presented the one chapter which has the section on marks and silkworms to Krezi. Um, I ended up getting to debate with there was someone in sociology at Essex who apparently is an expert on silkworms, and he pointed out that like this idea that certain labors are inherent to the species, to the silkworm, is even inaccurate in itself because silkworms only do that because they've been bred a certain way for hundreds of years. So even things which seem to be natural inherent features of sort of silkworms are in fact historical products of centuries of labor and production. Um, so yeah, so that's the way I tended to think about it. It was always kind of there's something a bit uneasy about making those kind of art labor comparisons, but I still find them useful. What do you think, Joanna?
Well, I'm thinking on, well, you said that. I'm thinking about like gendered labor or like, care labor that we do. And also in terms of strike, I think that was on the list of questions that Maitrayee sent to us. I remember with the Precarious Workers Brigade, we did this like great leaflet about like confronting your manager about like unfair working hours, unpaid labor, stuff like that. And the joke was that you're your own manager, right? So in terms of sort of work that you cannot separate yourself from because it is that kind of work of the self, that I guess that was our thinking, uh, how it sort of overlaps with these sorts of care work or work of raising children, family, and so on, that you cannot withdraw from. So like the whole idea of striking as being that kind of labor is quite problematic, right? So I'm thinking of that. I don't remember who is the silkworm person. Can you hear me?
Um, I forgot the name. There was a sociologist at Essex that when I presented that chapter, um,
Okay, yeah, yeah, because that's a very good anecdote in terms of this whole discussion that we're having.
um, that was actually a funny presentation because I had to bring along my then like I think 4-year-old son or 5-year-old son, and so here I was attempting to have a discussion around the history of silkworms while also occupying a 4-year-old. Um,
Yeah.
um,
Oh, there you go.
As for the question about whether the book would have been different, was it released at a different year or um probably. I mean, I think at a certain point we just decided that we could try to add in new concepts and respond to more current things, but it would essentially be another book. So, so um so yeah, maybe it would. I'm not sure, honestly.
I'm not sure either. I mean, given that these are essays, I mean, they haven't all been written in the same year, right? They've been written over the past decade. So it's really hard to tell where it will go. I mean, definitely if we were now to conduct this kind of study or the sort of metropolitan factory style study, I mean, it would all have to be completely different now. I mean, maybe what would have been smart would have been, I don't know, doing some sort of longitudinal study or something, or keeping in touch with the respondents. But obviously, we haven't thought about it back then.
Yeah.
So yeah, hard to tell.
Peter?
Yes, I mean, I wanted to follow up on what I thought there was a really a good part of the essays in the book, which is this tension between being creative and then essentially, how do you survive being creative? And I think the point you brought up, Stephen, about affordability was really important. I was wondering though, and I guess this is like a more intersectional thing that would be worth exploring, is the different types of skills that are necessary for this. And again, I guess from a slightly sociological perspective, which is completely not like a very small sample size. So I apologize that I'm bringing my own experiences maybe too much, but like I found it very interesting that when I went to university, there was a lot of people who did want to do things like photography, etc. And my first impression as one of the few working class kids at the university was that, well, the middle class kids are going to be the ones who are most successful. But that actually didn't turn out to be true. And part of it was because of something that you said, was that most of the kids that I went to university with who were into this, when they got out of university, they never had any experience of like ever working or paying rent or being able to do side hustles or things on the side. Like it was really interesting, like watching how quickly they just simply did not know how to like get a basic job. Like, yeah, like if you want to do like something you're passionate about, sometimes you gotta, do contract work at a construction site and you gotta go there on Saturday and you gotta get the job they give you, and then on Sunday you can play a gig, right? Um, but I also found that there was a very interesting racial aspect to this because the types of jobs that you could do in order to do this were so much more easily available to, I would say, white in the US, white Americans, right? So like walking in like DC, for instance, or Baltimore to a restaurant, if you were, to be honest, like a Black or Hispanic working class person and asking for a job, um, was often much more difficult than like if I just rolled up in there and asked for a job. And there's a lot of studies on this. That kind of racial dynamic is really key, right? And so I wanted to kind of explore that, like, as these are processes of managing these tensions, right? I wonder if there is an intersectional aspect about, first of all, the kind of maybe ironic skills that certain groups that you might not think have over others, right? I mean, most of the people I knew who were really, really into art, and then didn't do it as a career actually were the middle and upper middle class kids who ended up getting really good jobs, but not in art. Like they ended up getting
Mm-hmm.
six-figure jobs doing something different. Um, because they couldn't hack it, right? Like it took 6 months before they realized like, no, mom and dad need to hook me up with a friend at the country club to like give me something easier. But also like the types of people who could more easily get the types of flexible work that would pay their rent, there was definitely a very strong racial dynamic there. It might have disappeared as the economy's become much more precarious, but certainly all the way up to 2005, 2010, I found that in both the UK and the US. Um, so I didn't know if like you had explored that or have you, but I think that kind of, very strong tension that is brought out in the essays of the book, I certainly thought about quite a bit in terms of my own experience of like, who had the skills to be this resilient and manage this, and who had the privilege to do that as well.
One of the things that was certainly lurking in the background that maybe should have been there, but I didn't do as much because I didn't know how to do it properly, and I didn't want it to be a little tokenistic gesture. As I spent a lot of time reading people like David Roediger on the wages of whiteness, and W.E. Du Bois on the idea of the psychic wages of whiteness, and I think that is definitely a big component. But I just wanted to put that in a footnote and be like, oh, by the way, this is a thing. Um, but yeah, it is a thing. Um,
Yes, and there is a lot of studies done around that in the UK at the moment. I mean, I don't know about the US. I'm just trying to find out do you remember the last name of my former supervisor from City, Dave? He's been doing stuff on class in the arts, and there's the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Center, there's Arts Emergency, there are several groups that do studies specifically on this. So race, class, gender in terms of entry into arts and creative sectors. But yeah, obviously we didn't explore that in depth in the book. But yeah, anecdotally, yes, it's of course a big problem. And I think as we were starting working on all this, I mean, I don't remember. I remember when I started studying, it was still the sort of low low fees sort of situation, and then the fees rose with the Lib Dem coalition, and then they rose again, and rents and everything went up. So it's probably also affected the composition sort of people going into that kind of stuff. And I think another thing we mentioned in the book, but also could be explored more, is this sort of the whole approach of like higher education in the art and sort of creative industries that sort of still perpetuates the sort of individualistic approach to like being an artist or a creative, and there's still like very little sort of teaching done, I guess, again anecdotally because I haven't studied this exactly, but like often sort of creative skills don't overlap with sort of managerial or like how you call them, life skills or something. So I guess that there is a lot to be sort of done in that sense to sort of prepare students for the sort of even self-management that they will have to deal with, and all the other sort of stuff that goes with being a freelancer or a creative in arts and culture, right?
Joanna, who is the guy we talked to on the train going back from Manchester who works in Sweden?
Ah, I know I have his we have his details. It's on
Um,
that list. I forget his name.
I remember
Uh,
he was telling us about how like working actually in an art school, he comes to the position that sort of the crit session is basically useless, but he's amazed by the students constantly want the crit session, and they don't feel that they're fulfilled in their study at art school until they get the crit session, even though it actually isn't very useful.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah, yeah, yeah,
there's almost this desire we have to do a certain kind of performativity, to be legit.
yeah, yeah. I'll find him. What else?
Okay, maybe but like just round off the discussion with like a final thing that I wanted to ask. I mean, this book kind of, I also like that it's neither pessimistic nor optimistic, as you both mentioned. It's very open-ended. But I mean, we are also in a particular time whereby it's very difficult to think about our survival, and connecting to what Peter was saying, outside of the work structure that we're currently in, which is like even as a university worker or employee, you are pitched against one another all the time. The idea of value of work is also very much through this kind of reputation-based economy. So in a way, do you both feel we completely have to step out and redesign our own ways of course, it will need different skill sets and ways of knowing and contributing to society, and maybe that also allows us to diffuse some of the hierarchies of caste, race, and gender, etc. or there is still possibilities being inside the framework that we are in right now, which is actually quite dramatically each onto themselves, kind of,
I wish I knew the answer to that, Stephen.
I'm not exactly sure. Maybe what I'll try to end with is that's why I love the image that's on the cover of the book where there's a little boy who's making the boat, and I actually, despite a lot of the book being very critical about individualizing notions of work, I think there's something that I want to hold on to with the idea that you just want to do this thing, and whether that thing is just making a boat or a song, or I think there is something worth holding on to about the idea that the pursuit of pleasure and creativity in our interactions with the world as a value of it in itself. But the question is more, how do we have to shape the world to make that possible for that to be available to everyone and not just people?
I don't know, universal basic income?
Perhaps.
I don't know.
Fantastic, and I recommend everyone to read it. It's very well written and really kind of gets you thinking. And I love the note that we are ending here. Yes to more like ways of bringing pleasures into work and also building collective kind of affinities through that. Thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much. And can I mention one quick thing that will be a bit embarrassing, but I think it's worth saying? I think that it's not what Stephen said isn't just in um the creative industries as well. I want to say that in our own group, Stephen does so much work in terms of solidarity for all of us, in terms of helping people both formally and informally, and really supporting people so that they can, in their own life as scholars, do this type of work. And I think, so many times, like, setting up meetings or organizing things, all the background things that I think are really important in terms of, the wage work of dreams, like, or just people coming and saying, "Do you think I can do this?" And Steven's like, "Yeah, this is how you do this," or supportive. And I know he won't because he likes to be humble, but these are the types of things that people don't talk about. And I would like to highlight that in our group, Stephen is one of the people who really does this type of work. And I think anyone who's worked with Stephen will know that. So I really liked how you ended that, Stephen. And I really want to thank you because there's a lot of us creatively as scholars who owe the ability to do what you said, just write that book, write that article, do that course. I'm including creating the center for the Commons, which I said, Stephen, let's create a center on the Commons. You think they'll let us? And he's like, why not? This is what you do. So I wanted to end by saying, Stephen, you make it possible for us to do a lot of this work. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone.